Margaret's knees hit the concrete floor of the storage unit as the photographs scattered from her numb fingers. David's face stared back at her from a dozen angles, terror etched in features she'd kissed goodnight for 3 decades. Blood pooled beneath his head in the final shot, his wire-rimmed glasses cracked and askew. The oppressive August heat suddenly felt arctic against her skin. She pressed her back against the metal wall, the corrugated surface biting through her cotton blouse as her breath came in short, desperate gasps. This couldn't be real. David had died in his sleep 5 years ago. Peaceful, natural, the doctor had said. A widow's grief, but clean grief. "You okay in there, lady?" The voice belonged to Chuck, the auctioneer who'd been running storage sales in Newark for 20 years. His footsteps crunched on gravel outside Unit 247. Margaret's throat constricted. "Fine," she managed, the word barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Just hot in here. Take your time. You bought yourself quite a haul." The footsteps retreated, but Margaret remained frozen. Her eyes swept the chaos she'd created in her frantic exploration. Overturned boxes, scattered papers, the leather ledgers splayed open like wounds. David's handwriting covered every page in his characteristic green ink, the same precise script he'd used for grocery lists and birthday cards. March 15, 1994, J. Castellano, concrete shoes, Pier 7, $50,000 cleanup fee. April 2, 1994, Police Captain Morrison, monthly retainer increased to $15,000, requested hazard pay after Ferretti incident. June 18, 1994, witness relocation necessary. Mrs. Benedetto saw too much. Permanent solution approved. $25,000. Each entry was a life destroyed, meticulously recorded in her husband's careful hand. Margaret had always admired his attention to detail, how he could balance their checkbook to the penny and never forgot an anniversary. Now that same precision revealed itself as something monstrous. She forced herself to stand, her 62-year-old joints protesting. The storage unit stretched back 12 feet, crammed with furniture that now seemed like elaborate camouflage. An ornate mahogany desk dominated the rear wall, David's desk from his office, the one she'd thought was sold after his death. His business partner, Frank, had handled all those arrangements while she'd grieved. Frank, sweet, solicitous Frank who'd brought casseroles and helped with funeral preparations, who'd insisted on managing David's professional affairs to spare her the burden. Margaret's stomach lurched as understanding crashed over her. Frank hadn't been protecting her from paperwork. He'd been protecting her from the truth. Or rather, protecting the truth from her. She approached the desk with trembling steps. The drawers stood slightly ajar, as if someone had rifled through them recently. The bottom drawer stuck, then gave way with a screech of warped wood. Inside, a manila envelope bore her name in David's handwriting. For Margaret, if something happens to me, her hands shook as she opened the envelope. A single sheet of David's letterhead, dated 3 weeks before his death. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then my past has finally caught up with me. I know you'll never forgive the lies, and I don't expect you to. I started keeping books for Tony Torrino when my practice was failing and you needed surgery for your back. It was supposed to be temporary, just regular accounting for a businessman with unusual needs. By the time I understood what I was documenting, they owned me completely. The money was too good, and they knew too much. I tried to get out last year, but men like Torrino don't accept resignations. I've been skimming money from their operations and hiding it in accounts they don't know about. Enough to disappear, enough to start over. The account numbers are in the blue ledger. Take the money and run, Margaret. Don't try to understand everything. Don't try to make it right. Just run. I loved you every day of our marriage, even when I was lying to you, especially when I was lying to you, David. Margaret's vision blurred as tears mixed with the sweat stinging her eyes. Outside the storage unit, the industrial sounds of Newark continued. Trucks rumbling past, the distant clang of machinery, ordinary life proceeding while her world disintegrated. She looked around the unit again, seeing it differently now. This wasn't random junk abandoned by a dead mobster. This was a carefully orchestrated revelation, designed to surface after enough time had passed for the heat to die down. But who had arranged for her to find it? Who had ensured she'd be the winning bidder? The August sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the chain-link fence surrounding the storage facility. Margaret realized she'd been here for over 2 hours, lost in the rubble of her shattered marriage. Other auction winners had long since cleared out their purchases and gone home to normal lives. She gathered the photographs with mechanical precision, her antique dealer's instincts taking over. Evidence had to be preserved, organized, understood. But as she reached for the last photo, a handwritten note fluttered from behind it. "Mrs. Chen, we need to talk. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Riverside Cemetery, David's grave. Come alone, no signature, no explanation." Margaret Chen had spent 5 years as a widow. Now she was learning she'd never been a wife at all. Margaret sat in the storage unit until the fluorescent security lights flickered on across the facility, casting harsh shadows through the chain-link fence. The anonymous note lay crumpled in her palm, the paper damp with perspiration. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Riverside Cemetery. 20 hours to decide whether to walk into what could be a trap or spend the rest of her life wondering who else knew about David's secrets. The drive home to her small rental house in Belleville passed in a blur of traffic lights and familiar landmarks that suddenly felt foreign. She'd made this same route thousands of times during her marriage, returning from David's accounting office where she'd sometimes helped with filing during tax season. How many of those innocent-looking clients had been connected to the Torrino family? How many times had she smiled and offered coffee to men who ordered executions? Her house sat dark at the end of Maple Street, the porch light she'd forgotten to turn on making it look abandoned. Margaret had downsized after David's death, selling their colonial and buying this narrow Victorian cottage that barely accommodated her antique business. The front rooms overflowed with estate sale finds, Depression-era china, mid-century furniture, vintage jewelry that she cleaned and researched before listing online. It was supposed to be retirement income, something to supplement David's pension and life insurance. The pension from his accounting practice, the life insurance that had paid out without question. How much of that money had mob blood on it? Margaret dropped her purse by the door and surveyed her cramped living room. Every piece told a story of her careful, measured existence since becoming a widow. The Queen Anne chair she'd reupholstered herself during those long, empty evenings, the oak dining set she'd rescued from a foreclosure sale, spending weeks refinishing the water damage, small victories that had helped her rebuild an identity beyond David's wife. Her phone buzzed against the silence. Sarah Chen, her daughter-in-law, texting from Seattle where she lived with Margaret's son Michael. "How was the auction? Find any treasures?" Margaret stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Sarah texted every few days, dutiful check-ins that had become routine since David's death. Michael called weekly, usually on Sunday evenings. Conversations that covered weather and work and carefully avoided the topic of how lonely she might be. They'd encouraged her to move to Seattle, but Margaret had insisted she needed to stay busy, stay independent. The antique business gave her purpose. "Found more than I bargained for," she typed, then deleted it. "Just old furniture. Nothing special." She climbed the narrow stairs to her bedroom, legs heavy with exhaustion. The house felt smaller tonight, pressing against her like a tomb. David's presence had been surgically removed 5 years ago, his clothes donated, his office converted to storage for her inventory, his coffee mug relegated to the back of the cupboard. She'd been methodical about erasing him, creating space to grieve and then heal. Now she wondered if she'd been erasing evidence. In the bathroom mirror, Margaret barely recognized herself. Her gray hair had escaped its usual neat bun, and her face was flushed from the heat and shock. At 62, she'd thought she knew who she was, a retired teacher turned small business owner, a widow who'd learned to change her own oil and eat dinner alone without crying. Someone who'd survived loss and built something new from the pieces. But the woman in the mirror had been married to a mob accountant for 33 years, had lived off blood money, slept beside a man who documented murders with the same precision he'd used to organize their tax returns. What did that make her? She ran cold water over a washcloth and pressed it to her face, remembering David's last weeks. He'd seemed anxious, distracted. She'd attributed it to his age, 71, and still working 12-hour days during tax season. He'd mentioned retiring, maybe taking that cruise to Alaska they'd always talked about. He'd been gentler than usual, bringing her coffee in bed, lingering over dinner conversations. Had he known he was living on borrowed time? Margaret's phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet house. The caller ID showed a local number she didn't recognize. Hello? Silence. Then the soft sound of breathing. Mrs. Chen? The voice was male, gravelly, unfamiliar. You visited a storage unit today. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who knew your husband. Someone who's been waiting 5 years for you to learn the truth. What do you want? To keep you alive. David made enemies, and some of those people have very long memories. You found something today that certain parties would kill to recover. The line went quiet, except for that steady breathing. Margaret sank onto her bed, surrounded by the careful life she'd constructed from the ruins of widowhood. The cemetery tomorrow, the voice continued. Don't disappoint us, Mrs. Chen, and don't bring company. The call ended, leaving Margaret alone with the weight of choices she'd never imagined having to make. Margaret stared at her phone's blank screen, the mysterious caller's words echoing in the sudden quiet of her bedroom. Don't disappoint us. The plural pronoun sent a chill down her spine. How many people had been watching her, waiting for this moment? How many knew about David's double life while she'd remained oblivious for 5 years? Sleep was impossible. Margaret spent the night pacing between her kitchen and living room, the hardwood floors creaking under her restless steps. Every shadow beyond her windows seemed to shift with malevolent purpose. Every car that passed on Maple Street might contain someone monitoring her movements. The ordinary sounds of her neighborhood, a dog barking, the hum of air conditioners, the distant rumble of late-night traffic, felt sinister now, as if the entire world had been reconfigured around David's secrets. At 3 in the morning, she found herself standing before the oak dining table where David used to spread out tax documents during the busy season. She'd watched him work countless evenings, his green pen moving with mechanical precision across forms and ledgers. He'd explained depreciation schedules and business expenses with the patience of a natural teacher, never condescending when she asked questions about their own returns, the same methodical mind that had documented murders. Margaret retrieved her laptop and opened a browser, fingers trembling as she typed Anthony Torrino into the search bar. The results painted a picture of New Jersey's most notorious crime family patriarch, FBI surveillance photos, newspaper headlines chronicling decades of investigations, grainy courtroom sketches. Torrino had died 3 years ago, according to an obituary in the Star-Ledger that described him as a businessman and family man, with no mention of the violence that had built his empire. She clicked through article after article, absorbing fragments of a world that had existed parallel to her quiet suburban life. Restaurant owners who'd refused protection beaten unconscious, construction companies muscled out of lucrative contracts, witnesses who'd disappeared before trial dates, their families relocating under federal protection, all of it requiring careful financial management, meticulous record-keeping, David's specialty. The morning sun crept through her kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets made visible. Margaret had been awake for 22 hours, but adrenaline coursed through her system like caffeine. She showered and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that felt appropriately somber for a cemetery meeting. Her hands shook as she applied lipstick, the simple routine of preparing to leave the house now carrying enormous weight. By noon, she was driving aimlessly through Newark's industrial district, killing time before the confrontation that would either provide answers or destroy what remained of her carefully reconstructed life. She passed the storage facility, where Unit 247 waited with its cargo of devastating revelations. Other customers loaded furniture and boxes into trucks, ordinary people conducting ordinary business while she struggled with the weight of her extraordinary circumstances. Margaret pulled into a McDonald's parking lot and sat with the engine running, air conditioning battling the August heat. While she wrestled with her options, she could ignore the meeting entirely, drive straight to the police with David's ledgers and photographs, Let law enforcement sort through the implications while she retreated to the safety of official protection. They might relocate her, help her disappear into witness protection like so many others who'd stumbled into dangerous knowledge. But running would mean never understanding what David had endured, never learning why he'd chosen to document his own complicity so meticulously. The blue ledger he'd mentioned in his letter, the one containing hidden account numbers, remained somewhere in storage unit 247. Money that could represent either David's insurance policy or his death warrant. She thought of Michael and Sarah in Seattle, their uncomplicated existence buffered by 3,000 miles of distance. They'd built successful careers, bought a house with a view of the Sound, sent photos of weekend hiking trips and dinner parties with friends whose biggest secrets involved office politics and marital disagreements. Margaret had been proud of their escape from East Coast complications, their clean slate in a place where nobody knew David Chen or asked uncomfortable questions about inherited money. Would they ever forgive her for shattering that peace? For bringing mob violence into their carefully ordered world? At 1:30, Margaret drove to Riverside Cemetery with her decision made. Not the choice to seek safety or run from danger, but the harder choice to step fully into the truth, regardless of its cost. She parked near the cemetery office and walked slowly through the maze of headstones, many of them marking graves of people who died with secrets intact. David's grave lay in Section C, marked by a simple granite headstone that read, "Beloved husband and father." She'd chosen those words herself, believing them absolutely. Now they felt like the final entry in his ledger of deceptions. A figure emerged from behind a nearby mausoleum, tall, elderly, wearing a rumpled suit despite the heat. He approached with measured steps, hands visible, movements careful and deliberate. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice matching the one from last night's phone call. "Thank you for coming. We have a lot to discuss." Margaret stood straighter, drawing strength from some reservoir she hadn't known existed. "Then let's discuss it." The man studied her face for a long moment, as if measuring her resolve. Up close, he appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and deep lines etched around pale blue eyes. His suit was expensive but wrinkled, suggesting he'd been waiting in the heat longer than comfortable. "My name is Vincent Marconi," he said. "I was David's handler, for lack of a better word, for the last 15 years of his life." Margaret felt her carefully summoned courage begin to crack, standing in this cemetery, facing a man who'd controlled her husband's secret life. The enormity of what she'd stepped into crashed over her like a wave. "I don't think I can do this," she whispered. "Mrs. Chen." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "I spent 33 years married to a man I thought I knew. I buried him thinking he was a good person who'd lived an honest life. And now you want me to, what? Pretend I can handle learning he was part of something that destroyed families?" Vincent's expression softened. He was a good person. That was his problem. "Don't." Margaret backed away a step. "Don't you dare try to make this noble. I read those ledgers. I saw what he documented. Mrs. Benedetto, whoever she was, she's dead because my husband wrote down the order." Maria Benedetto owned a bakery in Hoboken. She saw Tony Torrino's nephew beat a man to death behind her shop. David tried to convince them to relocate her, pay her to stay quiet. They decided killing her was cheaper. Margaret's stomach lurched. "Stop. Please, just stop. You asked for the truth." "I was wrong." The words echoed across the cemetery, disturbing a cluster of mourners at a distant graveside. "I don't want the truth. I want my husband back the way I remembered him. I want to go home and pretend I never bought that storage unit." Vincent stepped closer, his voice gentling. "But you can't, can you? Because now you know those people died, and David documented it, and somewhere in your conscience you're wondering if staying quiet makes you complicit." Margaret's legs felt unsteady. She groped for the concrete bench beside David's headstone, the same bench where she'd sat during his funeral service 5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking support from a monument to the lie her marriage had become. "Why didn't he just stop?" she asked. "Why didn't he come to me, tell me we needed to run?" "Because he was protecting you, and because they had leverage." "What kind of leverage?" Vincent hesitated, his gaze shifting to David's headstone. The kind that would have destroyed more than just his life if it came to light. Margaret's blood went cold. Michael. They threatened Michael. David never told you about the scholarship that paid for Michael's law school? She stared at him. He received a merit scholarship. Full tuition to Columbia. Funded by a shell company that traced back to Torrino enterprises. David arranged it as payment for his services. Your son's entire career was built on mob money. The cemetery tilted around her. Margaret gripped the bench harder, fighting nausea. Michael's law degree, his prestigious job at a Seattle firm, the confidence that had carried him through his career, all of it contaminated by his father's blood money. Does Michael know? No. And David died to keep it that way. Margaret's mind reeled. Every proud moment, Michael's graduation, his wedding to Sarah, his promotions, had been tainted by connections he'd never suspected. If this knowledge surfaced now, it could destroy not just his career but his sense of self. "This is exactly why I can't do this," she said, her voice barely audible. "This is why I should have left that storage unit alone. Every answer just creates more damage." "Mrs. Chen, you're not the only one at risk here. The ledgers David kept, they document 30 years of operations, names, dates, financial transfers. People are still alive who could be prosecuted based on that evidence. People who have spent 5 years believing those records were safely buried with Tony Torrino. Then let them stay buried. It's too late for that. The moment you opened that storage unit, you became a threat. The moment you walked away with those photographs, you put yourself on their radar." Margaret stood abruptly, panic overwhelming her system. "I have to go. I have to get out of here. Running won't help. They know where you live, where you work, where your son lives. Don't you threaten my family." "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm trying to keep you alive long enough to finish what David started." Margaret took several steps backward, her mind screaming warnings she should have heeded yesterday. She'd been a fool to come here, a fool to imagine she could handle knowledge meant for people who lived in David's shadow world. She was a retired teacher who sold antiques online, not someone equipped to navigate mob politics and 30-year-old vendettas. "I can't," she said again, turning toward her car. "I just can't." But as Margaret reached for her car door, Vincent's voice stopped her cold. "They killed David because he was planning to give you that storage unit key." Her hand froze on the handle. The August heat pressed against her like a weight, but suddenly she couldn't feel anything except the ice spreading through her chest. "What?" The heart attack wasn't random. Mrs. Chen David had been making arrangements. He'd transferred the storage unit into your name 3 weeks before he died, left instructions for you to receive the key after a 5-year delay. He was going to tell you everything. Margaret turned slowly, her legs threatening to give out. "You're lying." He'd grown tired of the fear. Tired of watching you struggle financially while mob money sat in offshore accounts he'd helped establish. The blue ledger he mentioned in his letter, it contains access codes to nearly $30 million. Money he'd been skimming from Torrino operations for years, preparing for the day he could disappear with you. The cemetery seemed to spin around her. $30 million. David had been planning their escape, orchestrating their freedom, while she'd worried about mortgage payments and medical bills. All those nights he'd worked late, all those business trips she'd never questioned, he'd been building them a way out. Why didn't he just take it? Why didn't we run? Because he knew they'd never stop hunting him. He needed insurance, leverage. The complete financial records were his protection, mutually assured destruction. If they killed him, everything would eventually surface. But Tony Torrino got impatient. Margaret's knees buckled. She sank against the car, the metal scorching through her dress. "He died because of me, because he was trying to save me. He died because he chose love over fear. That's who your husband was, Mrs. Chen. Not the monster those ledgers might suggest, but a man who made terrible compromises to protect his family." Vincent approached slowly, his hands visible, movements careful as if she were a wounded animal. But his death wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Everything he planned, everything he sacrificed for, it only works if you finish it. Margaret looked up at him through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I don't know how. I'm not brave like he was. I'm not smart enough for this world." David didn't need you to be smart. He needed you to be exactly who you are, someone the authorities would believe, someone with clean hands who could expose 30 years of crimes without looking like another mob informant. The weight of it crashed over her. David hadn't just left her evidence, he'd left her a mission, the careful way he documented everything, the methodical preservation of photographs and financial records. It wasn't the work of a guilty man. It was the work of someone preparing to tear down the system from the inside. "The FBI," she said quietly. "That's who I'm supposed to contact. Eventually. But first, you need the blue ledger. Without the account numbers, you're just another widow with accusations and no proof of where the money went. With them, you have enough evidence to bring down what's left of the Torrino operation." Margaret stood slowly, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter window. She couldn't go back to her small house and careful life, couldn't pretend David had been an ordinary accountant who died of natural causes. The truth had been set in motion 5 years ago, and now it demanded completion. "Where is it?" "The blue ledger?" "Hidden compartment in the storage unit. David showed me, just before—" Vincent's voice trailed off. "I can help you retrieve it, but after that, you're on your own. My involvement has to end before the authorities get involved." Margaret nodded, understanding. Vincent had his own survival to consider, his own secrets to protect. David's plan required her to walk the final miles alone, carrying evidence that would either deliver justice or get her killed. She thought of Michael in Seattle, building a life on foundations he'd never questioned. Of Sarah's cheerful texts and Sunday phone calls. Of the quiet existence she was about to shatter beyond repair. There would be no returning to antique sales and lonely dinners, no peaceful widowhood built on comfortable lies. But David had trusted her with this burden for a reason, had believed she possessed the strength to see it through when his own courage finally ran out. "When?" she asked. "Tonight, after dark. The storage facility has limited security and fewer people around to ask questions." Margaret reached for her car door again, but this time she wasn't running. She was moving forward into whatever came next, carrying 33 years of love and 5 years of grief toward a reckoning David had orchestrated from beyond the grave. "I'll be there," she said, and meant it. The storage facility looked different at night. Security lights cast harsh shadows between the rows of metal units, transforming familiar landmarks into alien geometry. Margaret sat in her car at the entrance, watching Vincent's sedan pull up behind her. Through her rearview mirror, she could see him speaking quietly into a cell phone before ending the call and stepping out. She'd spent the afternoon researching FBI field offices, memorizing names and procedures she hoped she'd never need. The weight of the decision pressed against her chest like a stone. Once she retrieved that blue ledger, there would be no pretending this was someone else's problem. Vincent approached her driver's side window. "The night security guard makes rounds every 2 hours. We have 45 minutes before he comes back this way." Margaret nodded and followed him through the facility's maze of corridors. Unit 247 sat in darkness, looking innocent among its neighbors. Vincent produced a small flashlight and watched while Margaret worked the combination lock with trembling fingers. The metal door rolled up with a screech that seemed to echo across the entire facility. "Jesus," Vincent muttered, freezing. They waited in silence for 30 seconds, listening for approaching footsteps or voices. Nothing. Inside the unit, Vincent's flashlight beam swept across the familiar chaos of furniture and boxes. But now Margaret noticed things she'd missed before. The deliberate placement of certain items, the way the heaviest pieces formed a protective barrier around the rear wall. "There," Vincent said, directing the light toward an ornate wardrobe. David said behind the back panel. Together, they shifted boxes and squeezed behind the wardrobe. Vincent ran his hands along the wooden back until he found what he was looking for, a section that gave slightly under pressure. He pressed harder, and a panel swung inward on hidden hinges. Margaret's breath caught. The hidden compartment was larger than she'd expected, maybe 3 feet square. Vincent's light revealed stacks of documents, several leather-bound ledgers, and something that made her stomach lurch. Bundles of cash, more money than she'd ever seen in one place. "Emergency fund," Vincent explained, following her gaze. "David knew you'd need resources if everything went wrong." He reached for a slim blue ledger, different from the others she'd found yesterday. This one looked newer, its pages filled with David's careful handwriting in a code she couldn't decipher. "Account numbers and passwords," Vincent said. 30 years of careful skimming. He called it retirement insurance. Margaret accepted the ledger with hands that shook. The leather was warm from being pressed against Vincent's chest, and she could smell David's cologne faintly. Impossible after all these years, but unmistakably him. "There's something else you need to understand," Vincent said, his voice dropping lower. David wasn't the only one keeping records. Tony Torrino had his own insurance policy, a complete list of every cop, judge, and federal agent on his payroll. When he died, that list disappeared. "What does that have to do with me?" "Because David saw who took it, and he wrote it down." Margaret's blood went cold. "Who?" "Someone high enough in law enforcement to make evidence disappear. Someone who's been protecting the remaining Torrino operations for 3 years. Vincent's flashlight beam flickered across her face. "That's why you can't just walk into any FBI field office. You need to find an agent you can trust absolutely." The implications crashed over her. David hadn't just left her evidence against the mob. He'd left her evidence against corrupt federal agents. People with the power to make her disappear long before any case reached trial. "How am I supposed to know who to trust?" David left instructions. Vincent pulled a sealed envelope from the hidden compartment. Names of agents he'd researched, people with clean records and personal reasons to want the Torrinos destroyed. Margaret stared at the envelope, understanding that accepting it meant crossing a line she could never uncross. Inside that compartment lay everything David had died for. Evidence, money, and most dangerous of all, the truth about how deep the corruption reached. "Mrs. Chen," Vincent's voice was urgent now. "We need to move. Take what you need and leave the rest for now." She grabbed the blue ledger, the envelope, and 2 bundles of cash, stuffing everything into her purse. Vincent was already closing the hidden panel, his movements quick and practiced. As they squeezed out from behind the wardrobe, headlights swept across the unit's open doorway. Vincent killed his flashlight instantly, plunging them into darkness. "Security guard," he whispered. "Stay quiet." Margaret held her breath as footsteps approached, slow and methodical. The beam of a powerful flashlight probed the unit's interior, lingering on the furniture they'd disturbed. Her purse felt impossibly heavy, the evidence it contained seeming to radiate guilt. The footsteps moved on. Vincent waited another full minute before risking his flashlight again. "We leave separately. You first." Margaret nodded, clutching her purse against her chest like armor. As she stepped toward the door, Vincent caught her arm. "Mrs. Chen, David was right to trust you with this. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She walked into the night, carrying $30 million in account numbers and the power to destroy what remained of her husband's hidden world. Margaret's hand shook so violently she could barely turn her car key. The blue ledger sat beside her like a bomb, its innocent leather binding concealing enough financial secrets to topple governments. She'd made it 3 blocks from the storage facility before pulling into an empty McDonald's parking lot, her nerves finally overwhelming her ability to drive. The envelope Vincent had given her lay unopened on her lap. David's final gift, a roadmap through the corruption he'd spent years documenting. She tore it open with trembling fingers, squinting at her husband's familiar handwriting in the orange glow of the parking lot lights. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then Vincent kept his promise and I didn't live to explain myself. I'm sorry for the secrets, sorry for the lies, sorry for leaving you to finish what I started. But you're stronger than you know, and smarter than I ever gave you credit for." 3 names. 3 agents I've researched who lost family to the Torrinos. They have personal reasons to see justice done, and clean records I've verified through sources I can't name. Agent Sarah Kellerman, FBI Newark. Her brother was killed in 2019. Officially a drug overdose, but actually murdered for refusing to transport Torrino heroin. She doesn't know the truth yet. Agent Marcus Webb, FBI Manhattan. His partner was executed in 2018 after getting too close to Torrino money laundering operations. The official story was a robbery gone wrong. Agent Patricia Delacroix, FBI Financial Crimes. Her daughter's college roommate was found dead after accidentally witnessing a Torrino meeting. Ruled suicide, but Patricia's been asking questions for 2 years. Choose one. Trust your instincts. And remember, you're not doing this for me anymore. You're doing it for every family they destroyed while I sat in meetings and wrote down their crimes like a faithful clerk. I love you. I always loved you. Finish this so you can finally be free of what I've done. David. Margaret's vision blurred as tears fell onto her husband's handwriting, smearing the ink he'd carefully chosen to guide her through this nightmare. 3 federal agents, each carrying private grief that would make them allies rather than threats. David had seen the long game even while dying, preparing her to navigate a world where corruption ran so deep that justice required surgical precision. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen, Agent Kellerman's name hovering in her memory. A woman who'd lost her brother, who was probably lying awake at night wondering why the official investigation had closed so quickly. Someone who would understand the desperate need for answers that comes with sudden, senseless loss. But calling meant commitment. Once she made contact with federal law enforcement, there would be no retreating to her quiet life of antique sales and Sunday phone calls with Michael. The evidence in her purse would transform her from grieving widow to star witness, and everything that came with that role: protection, relocation, testimony that would put her life at risk for months or years. Margaret thought about her small house with its carefully tended garden, the routine that had sustained her through 5 years of widowhood. She'd built that life deliberately, choosing safety over adventure, solitude over complexity. David's revelation hadn't just shattered her understanding of their marriage, it had obliterated the peaceful future she'd constructed to replace it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Hope you had a good day, Mom. Sarah's making her famous lasagna tomorrow if you want to visit. Love you." The casual warmth of it broke her heart. Michael had no idea that his law degree was purchased with blood money, that his father's crimes had funded every proud moment of his career. If this came to light, when it came to light, how would he reconcile the man who'd taught him to throw a baseball with the accountant who'd documented murders for 30 years? But Vincent's words echoed in her memory. People are still alive who could be prosecuted based on that evidence. People who have spent 5 years believing those records were safely buried. Justice wasn't just about David anymore. It was about Maria Benedetto, beaten to death behind her bakery for witnessing something she shouldn't have seen. About Agent Kellerman's brother, killed for refusing to become another link in the Torrino supply chain. About every family destroyed, while federal agents on mob payrolls looked the other way. Margaret opened the blue ledger and stared at pages of account numbers written in David's meticulous hand. $30 million in blood money, carefully skimmed and hidden while he planned their escape. Money that could fund new identities, relocation, protection, or serve as evidence that would finally give the victims' families the justice they deserved. She scrolled through her phone's contacts until she found the number for FBI Newark, then sat staring at it while her future balanced on the edge of a decision. Behind her, the McDonald's closed for the night, leaving her alone under the parking lot lights with the weight of 30 years' worth of secrets and the growing certainty that David had been right to trust her with this burden. Margaret took a deep breath and began to dial. The phone rang once, twice. FBI Newark, Agent Kellerman speaking. Margaret's mouth went dry. She'd rehearsed this moment during the drive, but faced with the reality of a federal agent's voice, every carefully planned word evaporated. The blue ledger seemed to burn against her lap. "Hello? Is anyone there?" "Agent Kellerman," Margaret managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Margaret Chen. I have information about the Torrino family." The silence that followed stretched so long Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. When Kellerman spoke again, her tone had shifted completely. Sharper, more focused. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to stop talking and listen carefully. Are you calling from a secure location?" What do you mean? Are you at home? In a public place? Could anyone be listening to this conversation? Margaret's eyes swept the empty parking lot, suddenly seeing threats in every shadow. "I'm alone. In my car." "Good. I'm going to give you an address. Can you write it down?" With shaking hands, Margaret grabbed a pen from her purse, writing the address on the back of David's letter. "A diner in Belleville, 20 minutes away. Mrs. Chen, I need you to drive there now. Don't go home first. Don't make any other calls. Order coffee and wait for me. Can you do that?" "Yes, but—" No questions over the phone. "And Mrs. Chen, if you're legitimate about having Torrino information, then your life changed the moment you picked up that phone. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd known intellectually that involving federal agents meant danger, but hearing it stated so bluntly made it real. There was no going back to her quiet life, no pretending this was someone else's problem. "I understand," she whispered. "Good. 1 hour. Come alone." The line went dead. Margaret sat motionless for several minutes, staring at her phone's blank screen. Agent Kellerman had known immediately that this wasn't a routine tip call. The urgency in her voice, the security precautions, it confirmed David's assessment that Torrino corruption reached deep into law enforcement. How many agents would have warned her off? How many would have made a call to the wrong people before she'd even finished speaking? Starting the car felt like sealing her fate. As she pulled out of the parking lot, Margaret caught herself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, studying every set of headlights that appeared behind her. Was that sedan following too closely? Had that truck taken the same turns she had? The paranoia felt foreign and terrifying. Yesterday, she'd worried about quarterly sales figures and whether Michael was eating properly. Now she was driving through New Jersey darkness with evidence that could resurrect a federal investigation, wondering if trained killers might already be tracking her movements. The diner agent Kellerman had specified sat on a lonely stretch of Route 21, the kind of place that served coffee strong enough to strip paint and ask no questions about customers who needed to disappear for a while. Margaret parked under a broken streetlight and hurried inside, clutching her purse like a lifeline. The interior hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, and the permanent smell of bacon grease. A handful of truckers occupied the counter, but most tables sat empty. Margaret chose a booth near the back exit, positioning herself where she could watch both the front door and the parking lot. 23 minutes later, a woman in her mid-30s entered alone. Medium height, auburn hair pulled back severely, eyes that swept the room with professional assessment. She spotted Margaret immediately and walked over without hesitation. "Mrs. Chen? I'm Agent Kellerman." Up close, Kellerman looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, lines of stress around her mouth, the hollow look of someone who'd been fighting losing battles too long. She slid into the opposite side of the booth and studied Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. "You mentioned the Torrino family. That investigation was closed 3 years ago." "I know." Margaret's voice cracked. "But I found something. Evidence that was hidden. Financial records going back 30 years. Kellerman's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the slight tension in her shoulders. "What kind of financial records?" This was the moment. Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew the blue ledger, setting it carefully on the scarred formica table between them. "My husband kept books for them. Everything. Murders, bribes, money laundering, and the accounts where they hid $30 million. Agent Kellerman stared at the ledger as if it might explode. When she finally looked up, her face had gone pale. "Mrs. Chen, do you have any idea what you're holding?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "I'm holding the rest of my life." Kellerman's hand moved toward her jacket, and for one terrifying moment, Margaret thought she was reaching for a weapon. Instead, the agent pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with urgent precision. "I need to make some calls," Kellerman said, standing abruptly. "Don't move. Don't touch that ledger. I'll be right back." Margaret watched through the diner's grimy windows as Kellerman paced the parking lot, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from this distance, the agent's body language screamed agitation, sharp gestures, sudden stops, the way she kept glancing back at the building as if Margaret might vanish. The conversation stretched on. 5 minutes. 10. Margaret's coffee grew cold as she sat frozen in the booth, the blue ledger between her hands like evidence at a crime scene. The few remaining customers filtered out until she was alone with the night shift waitress, who studiously ignored her while refilling salt shakers with theatrical concentration. When Kellerman finally returned, her face had transformed. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more frightening. "Mrs. Chen, we have a problem." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where 3 people know about our meeting who shouldn't." Kellerman slid back into the booth, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I made 2 calls, one to my supervisor, one to our financial crimes unit. Standard protocol for evidence of this magnitude." "That sounds reasonable." Within minutes, I received calls from 2 separate assistant directors asking very specific questions about your evidence. People who shouldn't have known anything about tonight's meeting. Kellerman's eyes were steel. "Mrs. Chen, someone's been monitoring communications related to Torrino investigations. Someone with access to internal FBI systems." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. David's worst fears confirmed, corruption that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. She thought of Vincent's warning about agents on the Torrino payroll, about evidence that had disappeared and investigations that had died mysterious deaths. "What does that mean for me?" "It means we're about 30 minutes ahead of people who want that ledger to disappear forever." Kellerman leaned across the table, her voice urgent. "And probably want you to disappear with it." Margaret's hands began to shake. Through the diner's windows, she caught a glimpse of headlights turning into the parking lot, a black sedan with tinted windows that screamed federal government. "But friend or enemy?" "Agent Kellerman," she whispered. "How do I know I can trust you?" The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Kellerman's face cycled through expressions, surprise, hurt, and finally a grim understanding. "Because 3 years ago, my brother Danny was found dead in his apartment with a needle in his arm and enough heroin to kill a horse. The official investigation concluded he was a user who overdosed." Kellerman's voice cracked slightly. "But Danny was diabetic and terrified of needles. He couldn't inject his own insulin without hyperventilating." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. David's letter had mentioned Agent Kellerman's brother, but hearing the pain in the agent's voice made it real in a way that research never could. "The case was closed within a week," Kellerman continued. "No follow-up investigation, no questions about where he got the drugs, nothing. My supervisor told me to let it go and focus on other cases. That's when I started asking my own questions." The black sedan's doors opened, revealing 2 men in dark suits who moved with predatory efficiency toward the diner's entrance. Margaret's blood turned to ice. "We need to go," Kellerman said, following her gaze. "Now." But even as she reached for the ledger, Margaret knew it was too late. The men were already through the front door, their eyes scanning the room with professional assessment. The night shift waitress had vanished, probably into the back office to avoid whatever was about to happen. "Agent Kellerman," the taller man called out, his voice carrying artificial warmth. "Assistant Director Morrison asked us to provide backup for your interview." Kellerman's hand was inside her jacket now, definitely reaching for her weapon. "I didn't request backup, Agent Collins." "Miscommunication, probably. You know how it is with high-priority cases." Collins smiled, but his partner had moved to block the rear exit. "Why don't you let us help you process this evidence properly?" Margaret clutched the ledger against her chest, understanding with perfect clarity that David's careful plans had just collapsed. The corruption he documented ran so deep that even choosing the right agent wasn't enough. They'd been betrayed by the very systems designed to protect people like her. "Mrs. Chen," Kellerman said quietly, her gun now visible in her hand, "whatever happens in the next few minutes, do not give them that ledger." The words echoed in the empty diner like a death sentence. Margaret stared at the two agents blocking their escape routes and realized that her quest for justice had just transformed into a fight for survival. Everything David had died for, 30 years of evidence, millions in hidden accounts, the truth about murdered families, was about to disappear forever. All seemed lost. The standoff stretched for eternal seconds. 3 FBI agents with weapons drawn in a fluorescent-lit diner that suddenly felt more like a tomb. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched David's ledger, understanding that the next few moments would determine whether 30 years of documented murders would see justice or vanish into the same corruption that had protected the Torrino family for decades. "Agent Kellerman," Collins said, his artificial smile never wavering, "you're making this unnecessarily complicated. We just need to secure the evidence properly." "Secure it where?" Kellerman's weapon remained steady, trained on Collins. The same evidence locker where the Benedetto crime scene photos disappeared? The same filing system where witness statements get lost? Margaret saw Collins's face flicker, just for an instant, with something that might have been surprise, but it was his partner who gave everything away. The shorter agent's eyes darted toward the kitchen, then back to the rear exit, mapping escape routes with the instinctive calculation of someone who'd done this before. That's when Margaret understood. They weren't here to secure evidence for the FBI. They were here to eliminate it. The realization hit her with perfect, terrible clarity. These men had killed before. They'd murdered witnesses, destroyed evidence, made people disappear to protect their Torrino paymasters. Agent Kellerman's brother, Danny, found dead with a needle in his arm despite his terror of injections. How many others had died in similarly accidental ways? "Mrs. Chen." Collins turned his attention to her, and his voice carried the practiced warmth of a funeral director. "You seem like a reasonable woman. You've stumbled into something far more dangerous than you understand. Give us the ledger, and you can walk out of here tonight. Go home to your son. Forget this ever happened." The mention of Michael made Margaret's blood freeze. They knew about her son. They'd researched her, mapped her vulnerabilities, identified the leverage points that would ensure her cooperation. Michael, with his law practice and his pregnant wife, and his complete ignorance of his father's crimes. But even as terror flooded her system, something else crystallized in Margaret's mind. She thought of David's letter, of his meticulous planning and desperate hope that she would have the courage he'd lacked. She thought of Maria Benedetto, beaten to death behind her bakery, of Danny Kellerman, murdered for refusing to transport heroin, of every family destroyed while federal agents looked the other way. "No," she said quietly. Collins blinked as if he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Margaret stood slowly, the ledger pressed against her chest like armor. "You want to know what I found in that storage unit? It's not just financial records, it's photographs, surveillance reports, audio transcripts. My husband documented everything, including the federal agents who were taking Torrino money." It was a lie, but a calculated one. Margaret watched both men's faces carefully, looking for tells that would confirm her growing suspicion. Collins maintained his practiced expression, but his partner, Agent Barnes according to his badge, had gone very still. "Mrs. Chen," Barnes spoke for the first time, his voice carrying none of Collins's artificial warmth. "You're playing a very dangerous game." "Am I?" Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years of careful widowhood, the intoxicating rush of righteous fury. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the ones who are scared. Scared that 30 years of evidence is about to surface. Scared that families might finally get justice for their murdered children." She opened the ledger and began reading, her voice carrying clearly in the empty diner, account number 4,847,291, Cayman National Bank. Deposit February 15, 1994, 48 hours after the murder of Anthony Ricci, $200,000, split between federal informants and law enforcement contacts. Collins lunged forward, but Kellerman shifted her aim and he froze. Margaret kept reading, understanding now that David's careful documentation was her only weapon against men who'd killed to protect these secrets. Agent Patricia Vance, evidence tampering. $15,000 per incident. Agent Michael Torres, witness intimidation, $25,000 per operation. Agent Robert Collins. Enough! Collins's mask finally slipped, revealing something savage underneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The Torrinos don't just disappear evidence. They disappear people. And there it was. The admission Margaret had been pushing toward. Agent Sarah Kellerman heard it too, her weapon never wavering as the truth finally crystallized in the fluorescent light of a dying diner. Mrs. Chen, Kellerman said quietly, step back slowly and keep reading. Because Margaret had uncovered more than financial crimes or even murder. She'd stumbled into the deepest corruption imaginable. Federal agents who'd become executioners, protectors transformed into predators, justice itself perverted into its opposite. The revelation that would change everything wasn't just about David's crimes or the Torrino family's violence. It was about the people sworn to protect society who'd chosen to profit from its destruction instead. Margaret Chen, 62-year-old retired accountant, clutched her dead husband's ledger and prepared to bring down not just a crime family, but the federal agents who'd enabled them for 30 years. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Margaret held her breath, waiting for Collins to make his move. But instead of lunging forward, he did something far more chilling. He smiled. "You think you're so clever," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Reading names from a book like you're casting some kind of spell. But here's what you don't understand, Mrs. Chen. Those names, half of them are already dead." Margaret's grip on the ledger tightened, but she forced herself to keep reading. Agent Robert Collins, witness elimination specialist. $50,000 per... The shot came from behind her. Agent Barnes crumpled against the rear exit, his weapon clattering across the linoleum. Margaret spun around to see a figure emerging from the kitchen, a man in his 50s with graying hair and eyes like winter storms. "Vincent Torrino," Kellerman breathed, her weapon swiveling between Collins and the new arrival. "Agent Kellerman." Vincent nodded respectfully, his own gun trained on Collins with steady precision. "Mrs. Chen, I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but these gentlemen were about to make a very permanent mistake." Collins's face had gone ashen. "Vincent, what the hell are you doing? We had a deal." Had being the operative phrase. Vincent's voice carried the weight of generations. "You see, Agent Collins, my family may be many things, but we've never been stupid. Did you really think we didn't know about your little side operation? Using our name to shake down independent bookies, skimming from evidence seizures, eliminating witnesses for other crime families?" Margaret stared at Vincent, her mind reeling. "You're protecting me?" "I'm protecting the truth, Mrs. Chen." Vincent's eyes never left Collins. "Your husband David was a careful man, meticulous. He didn't just document our business, he documented theirs." He gestured toward Collins with contempt. "These federal agents have been using the Torrino name to cover their own crimes for 15 years, making us responsible for murders we never committed, thefts we never authorized." Agent Kellerman slowly lowered her weapon, understanding flooding her face. "The Benedetto murder. Your family didn't order it. Maria Benedetto was killed because she witnessed Agent Torres planting evidence in her neighbor's apartment," Vincent confirmed. "When she threatened to testify, Collins here eliminated the problem and blamed us. Very convenient." Collins backed toward the front door, his hand moving toward his weapon. "You're all insane. Vincent, your uncle personally ordered—" "My uncle died 3 years ago," Vincent cut him off. "Brain cancer, very peaceful, surrounded by family. Unlike Agent Vance, who I believe you threw off the Pulaski Bridge last winter." The pieces clicked into place in Margaret's mind like tumblers in a lock. David's careful annotations, the discrepancies she'd noticed between official crime reports and the financial records. The federal agents hadn't been on the Torrino payroll. They'd been using the family's reputation as cover for their own criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Chen," Vincent continued, "your husband reached out to me 6 months before his death. He wanted to make a deal. Evidence of federal corruption in exchange for protection for his family." I agreed. Margaret's legs nearly gave out. "David was working with you?" He was working for justice, Vincent corrected gently. As am I. You see, Agent Collins and his associates have been very bad for business. When federal agents commit crimes and blame organized crime families, it makes everything exponentially more difficult for those of us trying to transition to legitimate enterprises. Collins made his move, drawing his weapon and diving toward the front door. But Vincent was faster, his shot taking Collins in the shoulder and spinning him against the glass. The agent went down hard, his gun skittering under a nearby table. "Agent Kellerman," Vincent said calmly, "I suggest you call for backup, the real kind this time. Mrs. Chen has enough evidence in that ledger to clean house at the Newark field office." Kellerman was already reaching for her phone, her hands shaking slightly. "What about Barnes?" "Flesh wound. He'll live to testify." Vincent holstered his weapon and turned to Margaret with something approaching fatherly concern. "Mrs. Chen, are you all right?" Margaret stared at him. This legendary crime boss who just saved her life, trying to reconcile everything she thought she knew about good and evil, right and wrong. "I don't understand any of this." "Your husband was a good man caught in an impossible situation," Vincent said softly. "When he discovered what these agents were doing, using our name to justify murders, stealing from evidence lockers, running protection rackets, he chose to document everything, not just their crimes, but ours. Complete transparency in service of the truth." Margaret clutched the ledger tighter, feeling David's presence in every carefully written line. His final gift to her wasn't just evidence, it was allies she never could have imagined. A federal agent willing to risk her career for justice, a crime boss fighting to protect his family's reputation from corrupt law enforcement. Margaret Chen had entered this nightmare alone and terrified. Now, surrounded by the strangest alliance imaginable, she felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death, hope that justice might actually be possible. The sirens arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights painting the diner windows in alternating waves of color. Margaret watched through the glass as unmarked cars surrounded the building, federal agents emerging with weapons drawn until Agent Kellerman's voice crackled over their radios, calling for medical assistance instead of tactical support. "This is really happening," Margaret whispered, still clutching David's ledger against her chest. The weight of it felt different now, not just evidence of her husband's secrets, but proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Vincent Torrino stood near the counter, his hands visible and empty, waiting with the patience of a man who'd navigated law enforcement encounters for decades. When the legitimate agents finally entered, he nodded respectfully to their leader, a stern woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes like flint. "Assistant Director Morrison," Vincent said. "I believe Agent Kellerman called you directly?" Morrison's gaze swept the scene. 2 wounded agents, a crime boss, a terrified widow, and Agent Kellerman holding what appeared to be the most important piece of evidence in FBI history. "Mr. Torrino, Mrs. Chen, Agent Kellerman, what exactly am I walking into?" Kellerman stepped forward, her voice steady despite everything she'd witnessed. "A federal corruption case spanning 15 years, Assistant Director. Mrs. Chen has documentation proving that Agents Collins and Barnes, along with at least 6 other agents, have been operating their own criminal enterprise while using the Torrino family's reputation as cover." Margaret watched Morrison process this information, saw the moment when professional skepticism gave way to grim understanding. The assistant director had probably suspected something. Inconsistent case files, evidence that disappeared, investigations that died without explanation. But suspecting and proving were very different things. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison approached her carefully, "I understand you purchased a storage unit that belonged to your late husband." "He left me a letter," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she expected. "He knew he was going to die, and he wanted me to find the truth. About his work for the Torrinos, about the federal agents who were using that relationship for their own crimes." She opened the ledger to a page she'd memorized, one that detailed a payment made 3 days after Maria Benedetto's murder. Agent Collins received $50,000 for witness elimination. My husband noted that the Torrino family wasn't even aware of Mrs. Benedetto's existence until after she was already dead. Morrison studied the entry, her expression darkening. Mr. Torrino, you're admitting to financial crimes? I'm admitting to operating a business that kept meticulous records, Vincent replied carefully. Records that will show my family never authorized the murders these agents committed in our name. We may not be saints, assistant director, but we've never killed federal witnesses. Margaret felt the strange surreality of the moment, standing in a bullet-scarred diner at midnight, watching a crime boss cooperate with federal law enforcement while corrupt agents received medical treatment for their wounds. David could never have imagined this outcome when he'd hidden his evidence in that storage unit. But as the investigation team began processing the scene, Margaret realized her ordeal was far from over. Agent Kellerman approached her with obvious reluctance. Mrs. Chen, you need to understand what happens next. This ledger is going to destroy careers, end prosecutions, possibly overturn convictions. There are going to be people, dangerous people, who blame you for exposing them. Margaret nodded, having already considered this possibility during her sleepless nights of studying David's records. How many people are we talking about? Based on what I've seen so far, at least a dozen federal agents, twice as many local cops, 3 judges, and probably half the prosecutor's office in Essex County. Kellerman's voice was grim. Some of them are going to prison for the rest of their lives. Others are going to lose everything they've worked for, and all of them are going to know your name. The weight of this revelation settled over Margaret like a shroud. She thought of Michael, blissfully unaware in his suburban home, of her quiet life, her struggling antique business, her carefully maintained routine of grief and healing. All of it was about to disappear forever. There's no going back, she said, not really asking. No, Vincent said quietly. There isn't. But Mrs. Chen, your husband died believing that justice was possible. Are you willing to finish what he started? Margaret looked around the diner one final time, at the broken glass and bloodstains, at the federal agents documenting the scene, at Agent Kellerman who'd risked everything for the truth. She thought of David's letter, of his careful planning and desperate hope that she would be braver than he'd been. The Margaret Chen who'd walked into that storage unit 3 days ago would never have imagined this moment. But that woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that justice sometimes required ordinary people to make extraordinary choices. Yes, she said, her voice carrying across the diner like a vow. I'm going to finish it. The federal safe house in Trenton was a nondescript ranch home on a street lined with similar houses, each one hiding behind drawn curtains and the illusion of suburban normalcy. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, David's ledger spread open before her like a map to hell, while Agent Kellerman paced the linoleum floor with nervous energy. Torrino wasn't exaggerating, Kellerman said, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke with Assistant Director Morrison. We've confirmed at least 18 federal agents, 12 local detectives, and God knows how many prosecutors. This thing goes back to the Clinton administration. Margaret traced her finger along one of David's entries, a careful notation about a payment made the same day a key witness in a racketeering case had suffered a fatal car accident. The handwriting was unmistakably her husband's, the same careful script he'd used to write grocery lists and birthday cards. She wondered if his hand had trembled when he wrote these particular words, if he'd understood that each entry was a death warrant for his old life. Mrs. Chen? Kellerman had finished her call. The Justice Department wants to move forward immediately. Tomorrow morning, you'll testify before a grand jury. After that, we go public. Tomorrow. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Margaret had spent 3 days learning to live with the truth about her husband, but she'd had the luxury of processing it privately. Tomorrow, the whole world would know that David Chen had been the Torrino family's accountant, that their quiet suburban marriage had been built on a foundation of lies, that the man she'd mourned for 5 years had died not as an innocent victim, but as a government informant. What about Michael? Margaret asked. My son doesn't know any of this. He's going to find out on the morning news that his father was involved with organized crime. We can arrange for him to be briefed beforehand, Kellerman offered. But they both knew it wouldn't soften the blow. Nothing could prepare a successful attorney for learning that his father had laundered money for the mob, that his comfortable childhood had been funded by criminal enterprise, that his mother had spent the last 72 hours running from assassins. Margaret's phone buzzed against the wooden table. "A text from Michael tried calling you. Everything okay? Sarah's having contractions, but they stopped. False alarm, but we're excited." The mundane normalcy of it, her son's wife experiencing practice labor while Margaret sat in a safe house preparing to destroy dozens of careers, struck her as almost incomprehensible. In 12 hours, Michael would wake up in his world of law partnerships and baby preparations, and by sunset he'd be living in the same nightmare that had consumed her since Wednesday morning. "There's something else," Kellerman said quietly. "Vincent Torrino wants to see you." Margaret looked up from her phone. "Here?" "He's in the garage with 2 federal marshals and enough surveillance equipment to monitor a small country. But yes, he's here. Says he has information that might help tomorrow." The garage smelled of motor oil and concrete dust. Vincent sat on a folding chair between 2 card tables covered in recording equipment, looking less like a crime boss than like someone's uncle waiting for a doctor's appointment. When Margaret entered, he stood with old-fashioned courtesy. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for seeing me." The federal marshals retreated to give them privacy while remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. Margaret studied Vincent's face, searching for some sign of the violence she knew he was capable of. Instead, she saw exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "My nephew called an hour ago," Vincent said. "Tony Torrino Jr. He's been running the family's legitimate businesses for the past 3 years, thinks we should be completely out of anything illegal by Christmas. Good kid. Smart." He paused, looking at his hands. He wanted to know why his grandfather's accountant was testifying against federal agents instead of against us. Margaret waited, understanding that Vincent was working towards something important. "I told him the truth. That his grandfather's accountant saved our family. That David Chen documented evidence of crimes we never committed, murders we never ordered, corruption that was destroying everything we'd worked to build." Vincent's voice carried decades of weariness. "Mrs. Chen, tomorrow you're going to face questions about your husband's character, about whether he was a criminal or a hero, about whether you're seeking justice or revenge. What am I supposed to say? You tell them that David Chen chose courage when courage meant certain death. You tell them that he documented everyone's crimes, not just the federal agents, because he believed the truth was more important than protecting anyone, including himself." Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time since the diner. "He left me to finish this alone." "No," Vincent said gently. "He left you the tools to finish it. There's a difference." Tomorrow, Margaret Chen would walk into a federal courthouse and use those tools to bring down the most extensive corruption case in FBI history. Tonight, she was just a widow, learning that love sometimes meant carrying impossible burdens for the people who couldn't carry them themselves. The morning came too soon, gray and cold, despite the September heat that had been building all week. Margaret stood before the bathroom mirror in the safe house, applying lipstick with hands that trembled only slightly. The woman staring back at her looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed but determined, wearing the navy dress she'd bought for David's funeral 5 years ago. It seemed appropriate somehow, since today she would bury the last vestiges of the life they'd shared together. Agent Kellerman knocked softly on the door. "Mrs. Chen, we need to leave in 10 minutes. "I'm ready," Margaret called back, though she wasn't sure anyone could be ready for what lay ahead. The federal courthouse in Newark would be swarming with media by now, cameras and reporters, waiting to capture the first glimpse of the widow whose husband's secrets were about to topple a criminal empire that had operated within law enforcement for over a decade. The drive through Newark's industrial district felt like a funeral procession. Margaret sat in the back of an armored vehicle, the ledger secured in a briefcase beside her, while federal marshals communicated through earpieces in code she didn't understand. Through the bulletproof windows, she watched the storage facility, where this nightmare had begun, pass by in a blur of chain-link fence and corrugated metal. "Mrs. Chen," the lead marshal said, his voice cutting through her reverie. "We've got a problem." The courthouse steps were packed not just with media, but with protesters. Signs reading "Justice for Benedetto and Chen the Hero" competed with others declaring "Mob Widow" and "Blood Money." Margaret stared at the crowd, realizing that she'd become a symbol in a battle she'd never chosen to fight, representing different things to different people who would never know the real David or understand the impossible choices he'd faced. But it was the smaller group of men in expensive suits standing near the courthouse entrance that made Agent Kellerman curse under her breath. Margaret recognized the type even if she didn't know their faces. Federal agents, prosecutors, police officials, the people whose careers and freedom hung in the balance based on what she would say under oath. "They're not supposed to be here," Kellerman muttered into her radio. "This is supposed to be a closed proceeding." One of the men broke away from the group and approached their vehicle with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Margaret recognized him from the surveillance photos Kellerman had shown her, Assistant U.S. Attorney Richard Blackwood, whose signature appeared on dozens of prosecutions that relied on falsified evidence. "Mrs. Chen," Blackwood called through the bulletproof glass, his voice somehow carrying despite the barrier. "Before you destroy innocent lives with the lies of a dead criminal, consider what you're really doing. Your husband was a money launderer, a felon. Nothing you say today will change that." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a cold fury replacing the fear that had carried her through the past 4 days. She pressed the intercom button with steady fingers. "My husband was a man who chose the truth over his own safety," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for the nearby reporters to hear. "Can you say the same, Mr. Blackwood?" The prosecutor's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Vincent Torrino emerged from a separate vehicle at the far end of the block. Even at this distance, Margaret could see the ripple of tension that passed through the crowd. The legendary crime boss walked up the courthouse steps flanked by his own security detail and what appeared to be his attorney, moving with the measured dignity of someone who had nothing left to hide. "Time to go," Kellerman said firmly. "Stay close to me, Mrs. Chen. Don't stop for questions, don't engage with anyone. We get inside, we tell the truth, and we let justice take its course." The marshals formed a protective formation around Margaret as she stepped out of the vehicle. The noise hit her like a physical force. Shouted questions, camera clicks, chanting from the protesters. Someone threw something that bounced off a marshal's shoulder. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the courthouse entrance, clutching David's final gift against her chest. "Mrs. Chen, is it true your husband documented murders? Did you know about your husband's mob connections? Are you seeking revenge or justice?" Vincent's words echoed in her mind. "He left you the tools to finish it. There's a difference." As they reached the courthouse steps, Margaret caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Agent Collins, his arm in a sling but his eyes blazing with hatred. Despite his wounds, despite the evidence against him, he'd come to watch her testimony, to intimidate her one final time. Margaret stopped walking, ignoring Kellerman's urgent prodding. She turned toward Collins, this corrupt federal agent who had murdered innocent people and blamed organized crime for his sins. When their eyes met, she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at finding no fear in her expression. "Agent Collins?" she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "I hope you're prepared to hear the truth about what you've done. Because David documented everything, every murder, every bribe, every lie you told to cover your crimes." Collins opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret was already turning away, walking up the courthouse steps with the confidence of someone who had finally stopped running from the truth. Behind her, she heard the crowd's roar intensify, but ahead lay only the quiet certainty of justice finally being served. The real confrontation wasn't with Collins or Blackwood or any of the corrupt officials whose careers would end today. It was with the fear that had paralyzed her since David's death, the terror of living in a world where nothing was as it seemed. Margaret Chen had spent 5 years hiding from the complexity of love and loss and moral ambiguity. Today, she would face it all at once. Margaret had expected the grand jury room to be imposing, something befitting the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Instead, she found herself in a windowless conference room that could have belonged to any mid-sized accounting firm, facing 18 ordinary citizens who looked as uncomfortable as she felt. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and someone's coffee had gone cold, filling the air with the bitter scent of neglect. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor said, his voice carefully neutral. "Not Blackwood." The Justice Department had assigned someone from Washington, a thin woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd flown in specifically to handle what everyone was calling the most significant corruption case in Bureau history. Margaret Chen. Her voice sounded small in the confined space, nothing like the confident woman who'd confronted Collins on the courthouse steps. "Mrs. Chen, before we begin, I need you to understand the gravity of what you're about to do. The testimony you give today will likely result in dozens of arrests, the overturning of convictions, the destruction of careers. Once you speak these words under oath, there's no undoing them." Margaret's hands rested on David's ledger, feeling the weight of 30 years of carefully documented secrets. She thought of Michael, who by now had received the call from federal agents explaining why his mother's face was on every news channel in the tri-state area. Of Sarah, 8 months pregnant, and trying to understand how her quiet mother-in-law had become the center of a criminal investigation that was already being compared to Watergate. "I understand," Margaret said, though understanding and accepting were different things entirely. The questions began simply: how she'd found the storage unit, what she'd discovered, when she'd realized the significance of David's records. Margaret answered mechanically, walking the grand jury through the past 4 days while her mind drifted to the sacrifices that had led to this moment. "Mrs. Chen," Prosecutor Reeves said gently, "I need to ask you about your marriage. When did you first suspect your husband was involved with organized crime?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Margaret felt 18 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting for her to either defend David's memory or condemn it for the sake of justice. This was the choice she'd avoided making since Wednesday morning, whether to preserve the myth of her marriage or expose the complicated truth of loving someone whose integrity had existed alongside terrible compromises. "I never suspected," Margaret said quietly. "David was the most ethical person I knew. He agonized over claiming business expenses that might be questionable. He once drove back to a restaurant to pay for a meal they'd forgotten to charge us for." She paused, feeling tears threaten. "But ethics and innocence aren't the same thing, are they?" She opened the ledger to a page she'd marked, one that documented David's growing horror as he'd realized the true scope of federal corruption within the Torrino investigation. "My husband documented evidence of crimes he never participated in because he understood that silence makes you complicit. He died because he chose truth over safety, justice over comfort." "Mrs. Chen," one of the grand jurors interrupted, "are you saying your husband was a hero?" Margaret looked at the man, middle-aged, probably an accountant himself judging by his careful notation-taking. She thought of David's final letter, of his desperate hope that she would be braver than he'd been capable of being. "I'm saying my husband was human," she replied. "He made choices that compromised his integrity, then spent years trying to document the truth as penance. He was neither a hero nor a villain. He was just a man who realized too late that small moral compromises can lead to impossible situations." For the next 3 hours, Margaret walked the grand jury through David's evidence methodically. Agent Collins' payments for witness elimination, Detective Morrison's fabricated police reports, Prosecutor Blackwood's knowing use of perjured testimony, Judge Henley's predetermined verdicts in exchange for campaign contributions. Each revelation felt like losing David again, watching the man she'd mourned transform into someone more complex and more human than the saint she'd preserved in memory. When it was over, Margaret sat in the hallway outside the grand jury room while the citizens inside deliberated on indictments. Agent Kellerman found her there, staring at her hands. "You did the right thing," Kellerman said, settling into the chair beside her. "Did I?" Margaret's voice was hollow. 18 people are going to lose everything they've worked for. Michael is going to spend the rest of his life explaining why his father laundered money for the mob. Sarah's baby will grow up knowing his grandfather died as a federal informant. And Maria Benedetto's family will finally know who really killed their daughter," Kellerman replied quietly. Justice isn't clean, Mrs. Chen. It's just necessary. Margaret nodded, understanding finally that this was the sacrifice David had been unable to make, accepting that doing the right thing sometimes meant destroying everything else in the process. She'd preserved his memory by revealing his secrets, honored his love by exposing his lies, achieved his justice by sacrificing the peace he'd died trying to give her. The price of truth, she realized, was always higher than anyone expected to pay. The grand jury reached their decision at 4:17 p.m. Margaret was in the courthouse cafeteria, pushing lukewarm soup around a styrofoam bowl, when Prosecutor Reeves found her. 18 indictments, Reeves said simply, sliding into the chair across from Margaret. Agent Collins, Detective Morrison, Prosecutor Blackwood, Judge Henley, everyone you testified about. The grand jury voted unanimously on every count. Margaret set down her spoon, surprised to feel nothing resembling satisfaction. She'd expected some sense of completion, of justice served. Instead, she felt hollow, as if the testimony had drained something essential from her bones. What happens now? Now they're arrested. Now their families get phone calls that will destroy their worlds the same way yours was destroyed 4 days ago. Reeves's voice carried no triumph, only the weary recognition of someone who'd seen justice exact its toll too many times. And now you go home, Mrs. Chen. You try to rebuild whatever's left of your life. Margaret almost laughed at the word. Her apartment in Queens suddenly felt like a museum exhibit from someone else's life. David's coffee mug still in the dish drainer, his reading glasses on the nightstand, 5 years' worth of careful preservation that had been shattered by 4 days of terrible truth. Agent Kellerman appeared at her elbow. Mrs. Chen? Your son is here. Michael stood in the courthouse lobby looking lost, still wearing surgical scrubs from the hospital, where he'd been called away from rounds to learn that his quiet, widowed mother had become the key witness in a federal corruption case. When he saw Margaret, his face crumpled with relief and something that might have been grief. Mom, he crossed the space between them in 3 quick strides, pulling her into a hug that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Jesus, Mom, when they told me. When I saw the news. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered against his shoulder, meaning it in ways he couldn't possibly understand. Sorry for destroying his memories of his father. Sorry for the media circus that would follow their family for months. Sorry for learning that love sometimes meant carrying unbearable secrets alone. Sarah's in labor, Michael said when they separated. Real labor this time. I wanted to stay with her, but when the FBI called, you should be with your wife. Margaret touched his face, seeing David's eyes staring back at her with the same mixture of integrity and confusion that had defined her husband. Your baby is going to be born into a complicated world, but it's going to be an honest one. That has to count for something. Michael studied her face, perhaps recognizing something different in her expression, the particular exhaustion that comes from finally stopping the pretense that life is simpler than it actually is. Dad really did those things? The money laundering, the mob connections? Margaret thought of David's letter, of his desperate need to be remembered as better than he'd been. Your father made impossible choices in an impossible situation. He spent the last years of his life trying to make them right. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He loved us enough to die for the truth, Michael, even when he knew we might never forgive him for it. Outside the courthouse, the protesters had dispersed, leaving only scattered reporters and the detritus of a media circus. Coffee cups, cigarette butts, abandoned signs declaring Margaret both hero and villain, depending on the bearer's perspective. The September sun was setting behind Newark's industrial skyline, painting the concrete and steel in shades of amber that made even this harsh landscape beautiful. Vincent Torrino waited by a black sedan, flanked by federal marshals who seemed oddly deferential to their prisoner. When he saw Margaret, he approached with the same old-fashioned courtesy he'd shown in the safe house. Mrs. Chen, thank you for what you did in there. I didn't do it for you. I know. You did it for David, for the truth he couldn't tell while he was alive. Vincent's weathered face carried decades of moral ambiguity, but his eyes held genuine respect. My family has spent 3 generations learning that justice and vengeance aren't the same thing. Your husband understood that distinction. So do you. Margaret watched as Vincent was led away to begin serving what would likely be the rest of his life in federal prison, not for the murders and corruption he'd been falsely accused of, but for the money laundering and racketeering he'd actually committed. Justice, as Agent Kellerman had said, was never clean. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael, Sarah Grace Chen, 6 lbs 2 ounces. "Mom, she's perfect." Margaret stared at the message, tears finally coming as she realized that David's granddaughter would grow up in a world where her grandfather's secrets had been transformed into truth, where love meant accepting complexity rather than demanding perfection. It wasn't the legacy David had hoped to leave, but it was the one he'd made possible. The price of truth was always higher than expected, but sometimes, Margaret thought as she headed home to meet her granddaughter, it was the only currency that mattered. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and new beginnings, a sharp contrast to the stale courthouse air that had filled Margaret's lungs for the past week. She stood outside the maternity ward at 2 a.m., still wearing the same clothes she'd testified in 12 hours earlier, watching through the window as nurses moved between rooms with practiced efficiency. Michael emerged from Sarah's room looking simultaneously exhausted and radiant, the particular glow that comes with witnessing something miraculous after surviving something traumatic. When he saw Margaret, he smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the FBI agents had arrived at his hospital with their impossible explanations. "She's asking for you," he said, leading Margaret down the hallway past rooms filled with families beginning their own complicated stories. "She wants Sarah Grace to meet her grandmother." Margaret's granddaughter was impossibly small, wrapped in a hospital blanket that made her look like a precious secret someone had entrusted to the world. Sarah held her with the careful reverence of new motherhood, dark circles under her eyes testament to 18 hours of labor that had coincided with federal indictments being unsealed across 3 states. "Mom," Sarah said softly, using the title she'd adopted after marrying Michael. "Meet Sarah Grace Chen. We named her after you, Sarah Margaret." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, a grief she hadn't known she was carrying. David would never hold this child, never tell her stories about spreadsheets that made Sarah laugh or worry about her teenage boyfriends with the intensity he'd once reserved for quarterly tax filings. But this baby would know his name, would hear stories about a grandfather who died trying to do the right thing in an impossibly wrong situation. "Can I?" Margaret asked, reaching toward the bundle of blankets. The baby's weight settled into her arms like a promise. Sarah Grace's eyes were dark and serious, studying Margaret's face with the profound attention that newborns bring to their first encounters with the world. Margaret found herself thinking of David's letter, of his desperate hope that she would be brave enough to choose truth over comfort. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered, meaning more than just the baby's perfect features. Beautiful in the way that new life always was, uncomplicated by the moral ambiguities that would inevitably shape her understanding of family, love, justice. "The nurses keep asking if we're the Chen family from the news," Sarah said quietly. "I wasn't sure what to tell them." Margaret looked up from her granddaughter's face to find both Michael and Sarah watching her with expressions she recognized. The particular mixture of love and uncertainty that comes when someone you trust reveals themselves to be more complex than you'd imagined. "Tell them we're a family that's learning to live with the truth," Margaret said. "Tell them my husband spent 5 years dead being better than he'd been alive, and we're still figuring out how to love him for both versions." She settled into the chair beside Sarah's bed, still holding the baby, and began to talk. Not about ledgers or corruption or federal indictments, but about David, the real David, who'd worried obsessively about Michael's college applications and cried during sentimental commercials and spent Saturday mornings teaching Margaret to make proper dumplings despite her complete lack of culinary aptitude. "He would have spoiled her terribly," Margaret said, adjusting Sarah Grace's blanket. "Your father once bought a birthday cake for a client's dog, a golden retriever named Bernard who was turning 3. Michael laughed, a sound that carried 5 years of grief and 4 days of revelation. "I forgot about Bernard. Dad insisted we all sing happy birthday." "He practiced for weeks," Sarah added. He was terrified of holding babies, but he bought 17 parenting books when you were pregnant. I found them hidden in his office closet. As dawn broke over Newark, painting the hospital room in soft gray light, Margaret found herself telling stories she hadn't accessed in years, memories of David's terrible jokes and his obsession with perfectly balanced checkbooks and the way he'd always fallen asleep reading in his chair, glasses sliding down his nose, while financial magazines scattered across his lap. This was how she would remember him now, she realized. Not as the saint she'd preserved or the criminal others would label him, but as the complicated man who'd loved imperfectly and chosen badly and spent his final years trying to transform his mistakes into something resembling justice. When visiting hours officially began, Margaret reluctantly returned Sarah Grace to her mother's arms. The baby had slept through most of the storytelling, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed like commentary on her grandfather's complex legacy. "I should go," Margaret said, though leaving felt like abandoning something fragile and new. "Let you rest." "Mom," Michael said as she reached the door, "we want you to be involved in her life, despite everything, because of everything. We want Sarah Grace to know her grandmother." Margaret nodded, understanding that this was what David's sacrifice had purchased, not redemption exactly, but the possibility of building something honest from the wreckage of their shared illusions. She was different now, changed by truth in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. Outside the hospital, Newark was waking up to a world where 18 federal officials would begin their days in custody, where families would grapple with revelations that shattered decades of trust. Margaret Chen walked through this landscape with the measured pace of someone who'd finally stopped running from complexity. She was going home to an apartment that would never again feel like a shrine to perfect love. Instead, it would become something more difficult and more honest, a place where an imperfect woman could learn to love an imperfect man for exactly who he'd been. Chapter 18, The New Beginning. 3 months later, Margaret stood in her queen's apartment, boxing up the last remnants of the shrine she'd built to David's memory. The perfectly preserved coffee mug went into bubble wrap alongside his reading glasses, not to be discarded but to be integrated into a life that finally had room for complexity. The storage unit had been empty for weeks now, its contents either surrendered to federal evidence or donated to charity. Margaret had kept only one thing, David's final letter, which she'd framed and hung beside a photograph of Sarah Grace's first smile. The juxtaposition felt right somehow, past and future, confession and innocence, the weight of truth balanced against the lightness of new beginnings. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "SGC rolled over today. Thought you should know Grandpa's girl is an overachiever." Margaret smiled, understanding that Sarah Grace Chen, SGC in the family shorthand that was already developing, would grow up in a world where her grandfather existed in full dimension. Not the sanitized Saint Margaret had spent 5 years mourning, nor the villain the media had briefly painted, but a man who'd made impossible choices and spent his final years trying to make them right. The apartment felt different now, lighter somehow despite being filled with the same furniture and photographs. Margaret had learned that the difference between a shrine and a home was the willingness to let the past be complicated. David's presence remained. In the books he'd annotated, the kitchen timer he'd calibrated perfectly for tea, the careful handwriting on grocery lists she'd never had the heart to throw away. But it no longer demanded perfection from her grief. Agent Kellerman had called the previous week with updates Margaret wasn't sure she'd wanted to hear. 18 federal convictions. Vincent Torrino sentenced to life without parole for racketeering, though the murder charges had been dropped. Detective Morrison found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide that surprised no one who'd read David's documentation of the man's systematic corruption. "Justice isn't clean," Kellerman had said again, the phrase that had become his signature throughout the trials. "But it's still justice." Margaret had hung up understanding that she'd traded her peaceful widowhood for something more demanding, the knowledge that love meant bearing witness to the people we care about in all their flawed humanity. It was harder than grief, this acceptance of complexity, but it felt more honest than the careful curation she'd practiced for 5 years. The doorbell rang at precisely 4 o'clock. Margaret opened it to find Sarah holding a diaper bag that seemed larger than the baby it was meant to serve, while Michael balanced Sarah Grace against his shoulder with the practiced ease he'd developed over 3 months of fatherhood. "Grandma duty," Sarah announced, kissing Margaret's cheek before heading toward the nursery Margaret had set up in what used to be David's study. "We're having dinner with my parents. They're finally ready to hear about everything." Margaret understood. The ripple effects of David's revelations had touched every corner of their family's life, forcing conversations that had been postponed for months while the legal proceedings dominated headlines. Sarah's parents had struggled to understand how their daughter had married into a family with mob connections, even inadvertent ones. Michael had spent weeks explaining to his colleagues why his father's face appeared in news stories about federal corruption. Everyone was learning that truth was a luxury that required constant maintenance. "She's been asking for you all week," Michael said, transferring Sarah Grace into Margaret's arms. "I swear she recognizes your voice." The baby had grown substantially, her serious dark eyes now focusing with intent on faces that mattered to her small world. Margaret settled into the rocking chair David had insisted on buying when Michael was born. The same chair where she'd spent countless evenings reading to her son from books about brave children and complicated adults. "Tell me about Grandpa," Margaret said softly to Sarah Grace, beginning the ritual she'd developed over the past months. "Tell me what you want to know." Of course the baby couldn't respond, but Margaret had learned that talking to Sarah Grace about David helped her practice the stories she would eventually tell in earnest. Stories that included his laugh and his terrible jokes and his obsessive attention to detail, but also his mistakes and his fear and the way he'd chosen courage when it mattered most. When Michael and Sarah returned 3 hours later, they found Margaret asleep in the rocking chair with Sarah Grace peaceful against her chest, both of them breathing with the synchronized rhythm that develops between people who understand each other without needing words. "Mom," Michael whispered, gently extracting his daughter. "We're back." Margaret opened her eyes to find her son studying her face with an expression she'd seen before. David's look of concentrated attention when he was trying to solve a particularly complex problem. "You're different," he said quietly. "Not better or worse, just different." Margaret nodded, understanding that transformation was visible to the people who loved you, even when you couldn't measure it yourself. She was different, changed by truth, in ways that would continue revealing themselves for years. The woman who'd bought a storage unit expecting to find furniture to flip had discovered instead that the price of really knowing someone was the willingness to love them without the protection of illusion. "I'm learning," she said simply, "that perfect love isn't possible, but honest love might be enough." Outside her window, Queens was settling into evening. Millions of people navigating their own complicated relationships with truth, love, and the spaces between what we hope for and what we actually receive. Margaret Chen sat among them, no longer running from complexity, finally ready to build something real from the wreckage of her beautiful, imperfect, completely human marriage. She was home,